Hello, my name is Andrew Everett, and today my guest is Peter McGraw, who has some very impressive and interesting credentials. So let me go through that. He's a behavioral economist with a PhD in quantitative psychology. He's a professor of marketing and psychology at the University of Colorado at Boulder. He teaches a PhD course in behavioral economics as well as MBA courses in marketing management. He's the director of the Humor Research Lab known as HuRL, which may or may not be a reference to Wayne's World. We can ask him about that. Uh, and he teaches MBA courses at UC San Diego and the London Business School. And if that's not enough, he has a blue check mark on Twitter. And he's the author of Shtick to Business. So you wrote a book before this called the Humor Code, which was about what makes things funny. But this book is different. So maybe could you start out explaining the premise of this book and who you wrote it for?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. You know, when I hear these things, I recognize that I'm good at least labeling stuff, good at naming things. So the first book was a travelogue, a memoir, a pop science book about what makes things funny. My co-author and I travel around the world answering these puzzling questions. And I always said I would never write another book. So people are like, what's your next book? It's like, no, never going to write it. And then I had this idea. And so I'd been kind of working, thinking about how can I bring my day job teaching MBAs and my night job decoding comedy together. And my first thought was to write a book about being funny, about how to get ahead in business by being humorous. And I even gave some talks and started working on the idea. And I just found myself standing on stage in front of 100, 500 people and becoming concerned that I was going to do more damage than good by encouraging them to go forth and be funnier at work. And the reason for that is, while there are some people who are obviously quite adept at comedy, and I'm not just talking about professionals, I'm talking about regular everyday people, there are also people who are really quite underskilled. And if you license them, if you give them that encouragement, you really got to worry about what I call that guy, the guy who thinks he's funny. And so I was losing faith in this idea. And then I got asked by Google to give a talk around a similar topic. And I had this sort of moment where I realized it's not about being funny. It's about thinking funny. And having studied comedy and studied the world's funniest people for as long as I had, I had this realization that these people, yes, they're naturally talented, but they have practices, they have perspectives that help them create this very difficult product and help them pursue novelty in a way that most other businesses don't need to, but could stand to learn from. And so Shtick to Business is a book about thinking funny. It's about how to develop more of a marketing mindset, how to be a better manager, how to develop your careers using tactics from the masters of comedy.
Great. And one more question before we get into the meat of the book, which might kind of inform how you approach this, is when I think of behavioral economics, I think of the book Nudge, and I see that you teach marketing classes. You're kind of at the intersection of psychology and marketing, and I wonder if your focus is like consumer behavior or like what is behavioral economics?
Well, yeah. So behavioral economics, there's this idea of I like to say it's better to be lucky than good. So when I was beginning my PhD program, there was no such thing as behavioral economics. At least it didn't have the name behavioral economics. Really what it was, and this goes all the way back to the 1950s, to Herbert Simon, who won the Nobel Prize in economics based upon this idea of what he called bounded rationality. Essentially, that the economists of the world, the microeconomists of the world, were sort of unnecessarily assuming that human beings, people like you and me, are able to act like microeconomic utility models. That is, that they have a lot of ability to calculate, a lot of energy and motivation to get the answers right, to maximize utility, as they like to say. and what
Perfect
this
information.
exactly, that's right. An understanding of probability theory and so on and so forth. And so while economics was sort of the dominant theory of the social sciences, this group of economists and psychologists were pointing out the flaws and how it was sort of overly ambitious in our
It's not how the real world works.
exactly. And so this field has grown and really has been introduced to the everyday world through pop science books. You know, books like Thinking Fast and Slow and Nudge and Predictably Irrational and Freakonomics and so on. And so I grew up in academia studying emotions and decision making and looking at things like how do people's feelings about money affect how they spend it? How do people, like, for example, if you're an economist, you think of money in a very cold fashion. But if you're a psychologist, you recognize how emotional money is
Right.
to people. And when you start adding emotions into these models, you start having a much better ability to predict real behavior rather than to do what economists ought to be doing, which is how to prescribe rational behavior. That is, if you want to if you want to optimize, here are the rules that you should play by.
Right.
But Simons said most people are just interested in satisfying. They just want an answer, a solution, an outcome in life that's good enough.
Right. Thank you for that background.
No problem.
Okay, so I kind of have like a group of things that I lumped together here. There's a quote that says, "Without Larry David, there would be no Seinfeld." And then you also use a phrase that I really like called group genius. And
Yes.
I also lumped into there the collective intelligence versus individual intelligence and cooperate to innovate. These all seem like related subjects, but maybe you could speak to that general category.
Indeed. So there's a tendency I think, in the world of entertainment and certainly in the world of business, and some of it is perpetuated by journalists. You know, it's much easier to write about one person than it is to write about 2 people or 10 people or 20 people or an entire company. So we have this idea of the lone genius, you know, the Edisons and the Steve Jobs and the Dave Chappelles and the Seinfelds of the world. That is, these are a solitary individual who creates great products and creates great products over and over and over again, right? You know, that's a real test of genius, right? Not only can you do it once, but can you continue to do it? What I have noticed from both of those worlds is that while a lone genius may come up with an idea, the execution of that idea typically requires more than one person. And so when you start to look behind the scenes of these geniuses, you start to see other people of great importance. So for example, Dave Chappelle, in Chappelle Show, it's named after him, arguably, you know, the best sketch comedy show ever made, certainly in the modern era. Well, behind the scenes, there was Neil Brennan. Neil Brennan co-created Chappelle Show, was a writer on every single one of those sketches in the show, including all the ones, especially the ones that are, you know, sort of famous and made its way into the sort of popular vernacular at the time. You know, Seinfeld has a show named after him,
Right.
and yet Larry David and Seinfeld worked very, very closely together.
But Larry David was behind the scenes on that one.
Behind the scenes, exactly.
So how does that relate to business and careers?
Well, because I think the issue is that when you're making a product, when you're building a business, you need other people, and you know, it's very difficult to do it alone. And so I tell a story in Shtick to Business about Steve Jobs, and you know, Steve Jobs, you could put it nicely, he was persnickety, and you could put it much less nicely.
Yes.
That's there. And so there's a story about the iPhone team. So the iPhone team is a small group of people. These are high-level engineers. These are people who could work anywhere. And one of them shared the same name, Steve. And this caused problems because someone would say, oh, yeah, Steve approved that, or Steve said that. And it was not clear, are you talking about Jobs or this other Steve? And in a moment of frustration, Steve Jobs said to Steve, your name is now Margaret. You know what I mean? And so was that coming from a place of love, or was that coming from one of those other more negative descriptors of Steve Jobs? I found that to be really bothersome because Steve Jobs needed this other Steve in order to create the iPhone. And I think Bill Burr has a funny bit about Steve Jobs, who basically, points this out also. Like Steve Jobs says, all right, take all these things and put it in here. Now get to work, and so we need other people to innovate. And then to be able to do that, we need to be able to get along with other people. We need to be able to encourage other people. We need to be gracious and thankful for these other people. We need to be able to hold them accountable. There's a whole set of very important skills for the lone genius to be able to actually execute something.
Great. Yeah.
Oh, and if I may, just one other thing. Even Jerry Seinfeld, one of the world's most popular stand-up comics, who's writing his own material, even he needs audience members to tell him what's funny and what's not funny. So all of his practice sets where he's trying out jokes prior to a special is an act of cooperation where the previous audience members are making a more enjoyable experience for subsequent audience members. No comic tapes a special without having tested their jokes over and over again.
So people don't work in a vacuum. I like to think that a company should be more than just a collection of individuals. There's more power in people working together. That what you just said kind of supports that thought. There's another interesting phrase you used. Comedians live in liminal spaces because they never quite belong. I think liminal spaces comes from anthropology. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, I think it does. I mean, to be honest, it's not something that I had ever studied, at least not directly. So early in my career, I had done research on mixed emotions, on when people feel happy and sad at the same time. And one of the things that we noticed was, when is it that people feel this mixed emotion is often when they're undergoing transitions, when they're simultaneously looking forward and looking back. So at things like graduations and so on. So you could imagine a liminal space as a physical space, right? So a foyer is a liminal space. It's a place that you transition from outside to inside. But it can also be developmental or psychological, and so a lot of rituals are built around liminality as you transition from being a child to an adult, from being a worker to being retired, from being not a mom to being a mom. And so the idea essentially is that when you're in this space, either physically or psychologically, there's opportunity to see the world in different ways. And I got this from one of my interviews he pointed out that comedians are liminal workers. That is, that they live in these liminal spaces. They're just not good at fitting into the world in general. And so they're always sort of in this place where they don't quite belong. And there's a power to that because they notice the things that normal everyday people, that audience members don't notice. They just take to be normal. And they do that until a comedian points out, the classic, have you ever noticed, pointing these kinds of things out. Now, the question becomes, that's useful for comedy, but that ought to be useful for business also, because business is really built on identifying problems. And what's really interesting is if you can identify a problem that no one yet realizes is a problem, because it's only a problem because it's not a problem because there's no solution to it. It's just the way it is. And so there is there are these sort of moments of time where the entrepreneurs of the world really seem like comedians. The creation of Uber, really comes from a place of, now, why can't I just call a car easily to this spot to pick me up right now? It's just, everybody's just like, well, you just take a taxi or the bus or you walk, like that's just the way it is. And the founder of Uber questioned why that's the way it is.
Okay, so there's another topic. You talk about Net Promoter Score, which is basically those 1 through 10 customer satisfaction surveys that you get, right? And so you say, remember, the power of the chasm is not compromising. It's making people simultaneously love and hate you. Don't waste your time and energy trying to raise the low numbers. Instead, figure out what you're already doing to attract those weirdos who love you and then do more of it.
Yes, right. So this is in a chapter I call Create a Chasm. And this came from my observation of how comedians like a Bill Burr in particular, or even like a Dave Chappelle, has people who love them. And the more that people love them, there is also a counterweight of people who hate them. That is, the comedy is based upon individual preferences and values and lifestyle. And so it's almost impossible to make something universally comedic. And so what happens is, even though these comics are getting in trouble for the jokes that they're telling, they're going to continue to keep telling those jokes as long as the audience in front of them, the audience that they care about, are laughing. Mm-hmm. What happens in business, I think, is there is a reluctance to disappoint people. There's a reluctance to disappoint people. And I think that in general, you should avoid trying to disappoint customers.
I don't think it should be the goal.
But it shouldn't be the goal. That's exactly right. And the reason is that not everyone is your customer. So most brands, not all, but most brands, especially when they're starting out, are focused on a niche of people and want to build loyal customers. And the way to do that is to focus on their needs and make them happy, essentially make them laugh, whatever that equivalent is, and to be unconcerned about non-customers. And so, it's why customer satisfaction is something that companies care about, because when people really, really like you, they engage in positive word of mouth. They're less price sensitive. They're willing to tell you what the problems are with your product, not because they're angry, but because they want to help you improve them, and so on. But when you look at a mean, or when you look at an average of a customer service satisfaction score, that's not telling you the full story, right? Does it mean that everybody thinks that you're a 3, you're sort of in the middle of the scale? As I like to say, you're serving warm tea, And
I love that analogy.
People want hot tea. If some people want hot tea and some people want iced tea, and you serve everybody warm tea and try to make everyone,
you're satisfying happy. Nobody.
That's exactly right. But if you imagine you have a customer satisfaction survey, which half the people give you a 5 and half the people give you a 1, and your average is still 3, that's a company I want to manage, right? That's a company that I want to work for. That's a product that I find exciting, because now you're best in class for half of the marketplace. And so the Net Promoter Score is like super, super popular. In the Net Promoter Score, for your listeners and viewers who aren't familiar with it, what they do is they ask, first of all, for a recommendation. How likely on a 1 to 10 scale are you to recommend this product or service to someone else? That's already a problem, because there's a class of products and services that you just don't recommend.
Right.
The other problem is what the Net Promoter Score does. It takes your promoters, the people who are 10 or 9, and it looks at the percentage of those, and then it subtracts what they call detractors, the people who are 6 and below. And then you get the score, along 0 to 100, and it allows you to track your your satisfaction over time, or at least these referrals over time.
Right. So it's
And it
severely
allows
flawed because somebody who gives you a 1 or a 6 is the same.
That's definitely the case. But the thing is, why do you even care about the people who give you a 1, right? What you should be focused on is the distribution of scores. That's the thing that's important, because getting someone from a 4 to a 5 has no effect on the bottom line, has no effect on anything. But if you can get someone from a 7 to a 9, that has a huge effect on your business.
It sounds like this relates to make the connection between how does this apply to business and your marketing courses and so forth. This sounds like product positioning.
Absolutely.
If you're a Porsche, you don't care that people complain that your car's no good for off-road. You leave that to Jeep.
That's exactly right. Yes, that's exactly right.
It also I think relates to something I think Drucker spoke to, but which is that it's better to focus on building upon your strengths than to focus on your weaknesses.
I think that's also, I agree. So why is it, right? So there's, this is why we get things like feature creep, like you just keep adding things to a product. You have a tendency, what we should do is just play to your strengths, and be unapologetic about it. So I use the example in the book of Barry's Boot Camp. So if you're, you may be familiar with, CrossFit and Orange Theory and F45, these sort of high intensity training exercise programs. They work, you know what I mean? They burn calories, they build muscle, they're fun, there's community, there's all these things that are there. Well, if you go to Barry's Boot Camp, which tends to be on the coast of the United States, it's also a bit international and so on, and prior to COVID was growing really rapidly. You go in there and the music is blaring, like it's so loud, and it's sort of like club music, like it's like you're working out in a dance club. So I went to a Barry's Boot Camp in Hollywood, and it was so loud. I got off the treadmill and I went to the front desk and I asked for earplugs, and they had them in a big jar. This is not an unusual request. The room is bathed in red light, which, if you don't know this, makes you look fabulous, right? It just removes all of your flaws. And especially because they let men, people barely wear any clothes in these workouts. So men remove their shirts and work out shirtless. Women are in their sports bras and so on. So honestly, like, you can imagine this is not for everyone. And, but that's what makes it popular with Kim Kardashian and Jake Gyllenhaal, who have used it. If they turn down the volume, change the music in order to make me happy, now the folks who go to Barry's for this club-like atmosphere now are not. They serve hot tea.
Don't design your product for the mythical average customer.
Absolutely, yes.
Another topic in the book was third thoughts. Could you explain that?
Sure, yeah. So, I spend a lot of time in the book talking about creativity and the value of creativity to comedy and to business. And so my definition of creativity is a original, appropriate solution to a problem. That is, it solves the problem, and it solves the problem in a way that other people aren't solving it. Good jokes do that. Comedy rewards novelty. So much so, not only can I not tell a joke that's similar to another comic's joke, I can't even tell a joke similar to my previous jokes. There is no like greatest hits in comedy. You can't be the Rolling Stones and play Street Fighting Man every single concert, every single.
If I already know the punchline, it takes it away the impact.
Indeed, yes, that's right. So there are sort of two paths to a creative solution. One is divergent thinking, right? One is just we call it out of the box thinking. You know what I mean? Like there's a variety of different ways of taking things that don't seem to belong together, putting them together. There's a lot of ways that people may try to improve their divergent thinking. Some people are better at it than others, and so on. But another way to be creative is through persistence. that is to just come up with lots and lots and lots and lots of ideas. And so what will happen, for example, on Saturday Night Live is someone will pitch a sketch to Lorne Michaels and he'll say, not a bad idea, but that's a first premise idea.
Okay.
Come back to me with something else. It's the same idea that an audience member would have. And so it doesn't feel that special. And so I talk about having second thoughts, and then I want to say you want to have third thoughts, you want to have fourth thoughts, you want to have fifth thoughts.
Right.
Actually,
but it's not just about having more thoughts. It's about having an iteration of building on the previous idea, it sounds like.
Sometimes, but they could be completely independent. So in some cases that can happen. But the point is, this is like, it's not sexy. It doesn't sound fun, but you're just banging on an idea for a long enough period of time that your answer, right? Shtick to Business wasn't the first title of the book. It took some work to get that moment of as soon as I had Shtick to Business, I knew I had the title.
Right.
But luckily I didn't settle on an idea too early.
You write about writing, actually. 68% of comedic brilliance is the outcome of writing as a craft. And you also talk specifically about writing with pen and paper.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I just made up that number. But
yeah.
But I do think that actually, so one of my friends who was an early reader of the book said that she's read 100, 200 business books, and she's never read a business book that talks about writing. And I took that as a great compliment. And the reason is I think writing is a cheat code for life. And comics, we tend to think of them as performers, as people who are good at spoken word. But what underlies most comedy, with the exception of improv, is writing. So obviously film, television, sketch is built on writing, and largely on writing. So much so that Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld would lock themselves away and be unavailable when they were finalizing a script, because they knew that if the script wasn't funny, it didn't matter how good the actors were. Nothing else mattered. The script had to be very funny. And comics, the stand-up comics, most of their jokes come from a writing process. They're sculpted, they're adjusted, they're changed, they're tweaked, they're thrown away based upon their performance on stage. But the writing is the backbone to the jokes. And so the argument that I make with regard to the value of writing is threefold. One is that to write is a great way to keep records. That is to organize your thoughts. And so when you don't have a regular writing practice, we regularly have ideas and reflections and observations about the world, and they can just flutter away.
They evaporate.
They do. And so if you don't write it down, and so I think I have this. Look at this. Here's my notebook. You know what I mean? It's right here, and it's just ready to go. And I've got my pads of paper. Like I admittedly, I kill trees. I'm sorry. I recycle as much as I can.
I'm with you.
But so the second thing is that writing not only record keeps, but it clarifies. So there's a precision to writing that requires you to be very precise and clear in what it is you're saying and why you're saying it and how you're saying it and your choice of words and your choice of language and the way you position things. And writing helps do that. It's not as sloppy as speaking.
Right. Sometimes you think you have something figured out in your head, but when you try to write it, you realize you don't.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And then the last one is to communicate. That is then to take your ideas and have someone else read them and understand perfectly what you're trying to say without them having to ask you for anything clarifying. And so I think that, anytime I have a new project idea, I write a one-pager. And I write it first for myself, and then I write it second for, my advisors, my mentors, potential customers. It serves as the basis for the copy that I use. So I wrote a one pager for Shtick to Business. If you read the one pager, you can actually read the one pager. It's in a workbook that you can download off my website, petermcgraw.org. You can read the one pager for the book, and the one pager in the book look very, very similar because I did the hard work early on in that way. And so now I recognize that writing is difficult. I know that not everybody likes it, but fortunately it is, like many skills, something that you can get better at as you get more experience and you develop a practice around.
I think also going back to the idea of trying to clarify your thoughts, and it actually also relates to this idea of the genius. Is I think there's a perception that good writers just write, but writing is a process of developing the idea as well. You write it and you rewrite it and you rewrite it until you kind of figure it out.
Yeah, I think that it would be helpful so part of the reason I became a not bad writer was that I got very serious about understanding what went into good writing. And what's fascinating is that the world's best writers lament how difficult it is to write. And so once you understand that it's hard for them, then you can then take it easy on yourself when it's hard for you.
Right. And so any further thoughts on the importance of or how writing is an example of how writing is useful in the business environment?
Yeah, well, okay. So, I'm not a big fan as a MBA professor. I'm not a big fan of like huge marketing plans and huge business plans and so on. I like the one sheet. I like the one pager. I like an economy of words. One of my favorite stories is that if you're going to launch a new product at Amazon, you have to write the press release for the launch prior to starting on developing the product. And the idea is that if you can't write a press release that's newsworthy, why this product is going to be interesting and valuable, then it's probably not worth all the effort to create the product.
Right, and in order to write a press release, you have to kind of know who the target market is as well. So you really have to think the whole thing through.
Yeah, you have to articulate the problem, you have to articulate the solution, you have to understand who the competitors are. There's a lot that so the writing and your point about why I like paper so much is I think it just slows you down. And so I like the idea of writing. One is when you're not on your phone and you're not on your computer, there's just less, when it's just you, a pen, and a legal pad, there are less distractions, first of all. And so the other one is I just like the idea of you can write something, you can scratch it out, you can draw a little line, like it's less linear.
Right.
And it's slower. And sometimes you're thinking as your hand is moving versus when, if you're a fast typer, you're.
Do you think as a psychologist, or, do you think that there's any hand-eye coordination? Like, is there any reasons for that?
I'm not sure the answer to that. There is some evidence that that when it comes to note-taking, that handwriting via note-taking is superior to typing on a keyboard. And the reason for that is that when you type on a keyboard, you can basically type close to what's verbatim being said because of the speed. But when you write by hand, it forces you to sort of summarize, put things in your own words, pick the most important things. And so you move from having a transcript to having a tighter summary that you're much more involved in.
You're actually producing something instead of acting as a copy machine.
Indeed, yes.
So what you touched upon it, but one of the things you wrote in the book is after 91,000 miles crisscrossing the globe, Joel and I had plenty of material for our book, The Humor Code. I was wondering if you must have stories of interesting places or interesting people or interesting experiences. I was wondering if you could share one or two.
Sure. Yeah. So the subtitle for Shtick to Business talks about breaking rules, being fearless, and building a serious career. Right? So how can you learn from the masters of comedy to do this? And so one of the things that I think is impressive about comics is they are open to new experiences. They say yes to a lot of things. They experiment a lot with life. And I think that that's where you find a lot of growth, personal growth, professional growth, is saying yes to something challenging, trying something new, recognizing that risk and reward go hand to hand. So one of the things that we did for the Humor Code was we went to Palestine. We went to the West Bank. And I'm really proud of that trip because I went ahead and scouted it in advance. I was in Tel Aviv, and I got connected with a sketch comedy group that had a TV show on Palestinian national television. And I took a car to the border one day and crossed over and met one of the performers and one of the writers at a cafe in Ramallah. And that was an exciting, scary proposition, but it was one that I realized was not as scary, as it's made out to be. It was a really wonderful connection and ended up being a really great chapter. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book because it's such an adventure to be able to go and see comedy in a place that most people never get to see comedy, because A, there's not a lot of it, and because B, no one goes to Palestine. And as a result of it, I have a much richer understanding of the Middle East and of the relationship between the Arab world and Israel as a result of that. And so, what I like to do is people have to work within their comfort zones. I'm a very comfortable world traveler at that stage in my life. I wouldn't say if you've never traveled abroad, don't start off by going to Palestine. But if you can look for places in your life where you're going to seek out new challenges, I think that there is really an opportunity for growth and a better understanding of the world. And in this case, it made for a better product.
Great. Yeah. All right. Well, I thank you so much for your time today. It's the book again is here we go. I'll get it up there. Shtick to Business. And thank you for joining me. And I think that's a wrap.
Andrew, I have to say this, you're like super kind, and I really appreciate both the thoughtful things that you've asked and the thoughtful things you've written about the book. It's nice to know at least one person likes it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cheers.